a public service and give you three main pieces of characterization about Ethiopia in order for you to understand the debate. So first piece of characterization, it is one of the only Christian governments in North Africa. In fact, it is only one of the only countries within North Africa to ever have a native Christian tradition and to escape the Islamic Enlightenment completely. Up to 90% of its population is Christian, and its government is therefore also Christian. But note that the countries surrounding it, like Libya, like Tunisia, like Algeria, like Egypt, all are Muslim governments that align closely with, for example, Saudi Arabia. And note that also, because it is a Christian government, there are large rifts of Muslim oppression that occur within Ethiopia. Not only because the government is afraid of losing their religious dominance, losing that mandate to power, which is based on religion, but also furthermore, the casual Islamophobia that has been rising globally due to the rise in both regional terrorism as well as global terrorism. Second piece of critical framing, a lot of North Africa, even though it is a lot of Ethiopia, even though it resides within North Africa, does not align with the rest of North Africa, either ideologically, because a lot of the alignment is religious in nature, but also in policy, does not participate, for example, in a collaborative effort to stop ISIS and the spread of terrorism in North Africa. Third piece of characterization about the Ethiopian government that's important to know. It's incredibly unstable. I think this was stated in the info slide in the sense that it is always in the brink of civil war, and it's incredibly impoverished. Even though it is one of the only states in Africa to escape colonialism, note the way they did this was to offer huge sums of money to colonizers to escape it, right? So this means that years of drainage meant that it is an incredibly impoverished country. I think this is a prime opportunity for Saudi Arabia to advance its three key interests. Number one, its clout as a regional actor. Number two, its ability to fight in proxy wars, for example, in Libya. And number three, to cement its own internal legitimacy within the country. So first, I'm going to prove to you, before I tell you about our impacts, about why we'll have a high likelihood of presenting a real and tangible threat to the Ethiopian government. Two main reasons, right? To the extent that we now, for example, give loads of support to the TPLF in terms of arms, in terms of resources, in terms of supporting them rhetorically on the global stage, right? So two reasons why they then are able to present a real and visceral threat to Ethiopian government. Note that we can always we can probably outmatch the Ethiopian government in terms of resources provided, right? So to the extent that we highly arm the TPLF with resources, with arms, the government knows that if it is, for example, going to fight the TPLF and not concede to, for example, its demands for more regional authority, for example, or just for example, stop the persecution of ethnic minorities that are maybe Muslim in nature in the TPLF, the government knows that it is in for a protracted and difficult war of attrition, right? It's hard to shut down things like regional separation, and they're unlikely ever going to be able to successfully suppress it totally, to the extent they are competing with the resources of an oil-rich nation like Saudi Arabia. So to the extent they know that we're funding them, and the TPLF have a vocal support, they know that they have to, for example, at least appease the demands of the TPLF, because otherwise, note that they're going to be put into a war that is going to kill people, but furthermore, it's also going to reduce its ability to economically grow, because wars are typically bad for stability and economic growth. Note that this damage in economic growth is also going to damage the government's popular support base in, for example, places that are not in the capital, because they care about their own economic welfare, right? Because they are seen to be failing the war that's causing economic damage. I think this also means they lose that popular support base. Second reason why it's likely going to present a visceral threat. Note that the TPLF isn't the only body that has anti-government sentiment, right? Anti-establishment sentiment also comes from a wide myriad of other actors, which is why civil war is always highly likely within the country, right? There are people who are just sick and tired of the corruption and the religious zealotry that the government is forwarding, right? For example, Ethiopia was heavily affected by things like the Arab Spring, even if it is not traditionally known as a quote-unquote Arab country, right? That there were rises of progressives and young people that were sick of how poor they were, as well as how religiously corrupt their country was. I think because of this, there's a real risk of the Ethiopian government of contagion, right? The idea that TPLF is standing up to the government and they have resources to do so. This is also our time to, for example, fight the government, dismount them, and then just to replace it from the ground up. I think the Ethiopian Ethiopian government knows that it's a risk of contagion. So even if it is a small population, it has a real risk of contaminating all other populations that also have anti-government sentiment. This is why it presents a real and visceral threat. Note that there is a real possibility that we could actually be successful in dismounting and dismantling the government, right? Because we could have the support of all these other anti-government actors that are quite significant in population, and also we could outmatch them in resources. But even if we don't win at dismantling the government, we have presented a real and visceral threat such that they want to appease us, right? So they're probably aligned closer to our interests in the future. Before I go on to tell you about how we forward those interests, closing.
Yes, I think a key piece of context that you missed out is the fact that the Ethiopian army specifically is extremely competent, which is why they've been able to survive through being a Christian nation surrounded by hostile Muslim nations.
Yeah, I don't know. Like, I think this is just an assertion that the military is super competent, right? So, for example, like what makes a military competent is resources. I told you that Ethiopia is particularly resource poor, but also things like if they are competent, Saudi Arabia's like military resources and expertise are also equally competent to the extent that fighting like 3 proxy wars in the Middle East, right? You need to make this comparative with the resources that Saudi Arabia has. So 3 main interests that we now forward. Number 1, your clout within the region, right? To the extent you have forced alignment from Ethiopia with Saudi Arabia, probably your dominance as a regional actor grows because you're seen, for example, just like to have forced, like it is quite an impressive feat, right? So you deter other governments, for example, from stepping out of line because you could also do the same thing to them, right? Furthermore, to the fact that you are now seen as the de facto leader of the region, to the extent you could force an entire government to align with you, you can now also dictate the direction of policy better when it comes to dictating what that regional policy is. Second interest, right? Proxy wars. So I think Ethiopia could be incredibly useful in fighting a lot of proxy wars, especially in Libya, right? Where you have real threats such as ISIS. Now they're more willing to offer you, for example, arms or like boots on the ground in fighting these regional conflicts and cementing your ability, your hold and power within governments like Libya, where you could be dismounted and your proxy government could have been displaced, right, by the terrorism cell. Because of this, they're more likely going to fight with you along these proxy wars, and you're more likely to win them. Third and final thing, internal legitimacy. To the extent that we seem like we're protecting Muslim minorities and standing up to a oppressive Christian government, I think this is just good for our internal optics, which is highly needed after loads of people are being increasingly dissatisfied with how Saudi Arabia is conducting itself. For all of these reasons, OG takes this debate.
I thank the speaker for their comments and now call on the Leader of Opposition. Hear, hear.
Am I audible? Great. Start the speech in 3, 2, 1. There are 2 main interests in Saudi Arabia in Africa. The first one is to still be the leader of the Arab League. It's important for them to have a coalition against Iran, to have the Arab power around the world, especially in Africa to be part of their political power and part of the influence of the Arab world. And they get tons of benefit from that because the West and many countries contributing to Saudi Arabia because they know the other leader of the Arab League. The second one is the economic trade with Africa, which I'm going to much more explain about it in my argument. We're going to analyze 2 things inside of OO. The first one is why they're going to lose their position as the leader of the Arab League inside of Africa. The second, why they will have much worse economic and trade connections with Africa as a whole in the future, and what's really important for Saudi Arabia. Before that, 1 point of rebuttal to what we got from OG. So notice that all of OG's case lies on the assertion that they actually are going to succeed. And all the analysis that we get from that, how for some reason 6% of the population is going to win the Ethiopian army, is that they will have more resources. Zero idea how it makes them make huge army that is going to defeat Ethiopia. No idea why. But more reasons why it's just not likely to succeed. First of all, it's just unlikely that Saudi Arabia is going to send like full army to attack Ethiopia and to actually make a war because it's far away. The public doesn't really care about it so much. People are going to die. It's just unlikely to do so in any other country that contributed to fighting in different countries didn't send their whole army. We see like Russia in Syria and countries like that. Secondly, the money itself is just not enough. We think that the Ethiopian army is just huge army, it's the strongest army in Ethiopia, by the way. We think that they just control the area. They know the area geographically much better. They know intelligence much better than anything Saudi Arabia they can. This TPLF has no training on fighting in these wars. This money is just unlikely to succeed. But even if it will succeed, I really have no idea why the alternative is better for Saudi Arabia. Still, the majority are Christians, like OG was saying. So I really don't know why it's going to be more pro-Saudi Arabia tomorrow. Let's move to my first argument, why they will lose the leading conflict, the leading position that they have in Africa. So first of all, why they'll make conflict. So we think that, first of all, you need to notice that Sudan and Egypt are like great power of the Arab League and the greatest powers in Africa. They are the ones who have the best economy and they're not in civil war. Sudan finished their civil war recently, therefore they are not the biggest economies of the Arab League in Africa. I think that currently there is a huge conflict that Ethiopia and Egypt are in the one side and Sudan is on the other side. Because Sudan is now trying to build a dam that will actually block the water to getting from to Ethiopia and to Egypt, which are severely rely on. It's their source of life. There are cities nearby all around the water, and specifically with now the condition of the global warming, it's such a huge issue in Africa to actually have water. Therefore, it's a huge conflict that is now growing. That there are two major Arab countries from both sides of the conflict. We think that this is why the status quo. Saudi Arabia is the best actor to mediate between these countries. They have very good relations with both Egypt and Sudan. They are the leaders of the league. They are the greatest power. Therefore, they can actually do this mediation and they have a really important position there. Why now they're going to just exclude them from being in this mediation and put them out of this really important conflict in Africa? First of all, just Ethiopia is really unlikely to accept them. They are literally undermining their leadership. They're undermining their position in Africa. They're just unlikely to contribute or to talk to them at all when they are literally doing civil war inside these countries and fund terrorists inside the country. It's just unlikely that they're going to cooperate further. We think that Egypt needs Ethiopia on their side, and they can do it without it. First of all, because it's the problem of these two countries, and one of them has much less power than the two of them together compared to Sudan. And secondly, just geographically, Ethiopia is closer to Sudan. Therefore, if Ethiopia is not part of the deal, Egypt won't get anything at all because Ethiopia can block the water in their country. Therefore, we think it is much more likely they will have alternatives. Alternatives can be, and we think that most plausible is they're just going to do it alone. We think that Egypt has enough power, Sudan has enough power. This is exactly where Saudi Arabia loses its leadership in Africa, and Sudan and Egypt are getting into it. This is everything that maybe the West can get, maybe China or Russia, because they all have a huge incentive in Africa. We think that this is extremely bad to lose their power. First of all, because OG just concedes that it's really important for them to be the leader of the Arab world. But most of all, they can benefit a lot from this negotiation and being the leader. They can benefit to set the conditions. They can say that they will sell all these weapons to Sudan in order for them to accept some agreement and therefore gain a lot of money to themselves. They can put international powers of the Saudi Arabia inside Africa to make sure the peace contains and therefore get a lot of power in Africa. They are, and therefore also in future conflicts in Africa, they're much less likely are going to be the leader because Ethiopia is now one of the main economic and big countries in Africa, and they're just not likely to cooperate with Saudi Arabia. This is exactly how they lose the leadership, and I think it's horrible. And before I continue, I'll take closing.
Yeah, so this is just a softball. I'm wondering what is really the comparative for your side in terms of changing the relationship with Sudan and Egypt? I'm unclear right now how.
No, I explain what is the comparative. They don't have Saudi Arabia to mediate. Therefore, either one of them is going to step forward and just do it themselves. Egypt is strong enough and it's competing with Saudi Arabia in the top league, Arab League. They are most likely want to step forward when Saudi Arabia is out of the game, or other countries that are just not a part of this league and they will lose this power as well. Now, the second argument, why it would damage their relations with Africa generally. I think that first of all, I think Africa is extremely important to the future economics of Saudi Arabia. First of all, because as the population is growing so fast in Ethiopia, in Africa, there are going to be billion people inside of Africa till 2050. Secondly, I think that this economic growth around the world, they really need human labor, especially when China is getting more and more expensive. The east of Asia is getting more and more expensive, and they need cheap labor to work in manufacturing, to go to factories in the future. This is exactly why Africa is the future of economy. This is exactly why the West and China and Russia is investing tons of money to control and big greater power inside of Africa as a whole. Ethiopia is an extremely important country inside of Africa because A, it's the biggest economy in Africa today. Most of the countries are dependent on their exports, on their politically power, on their security and army power. We think that it's unlikely that any country in Africa will deal with the country that's actually in war with Ethiopia in the first place. And we think that it's extremely important for them to keep these relations. We think that once they are losing the relation, they are much less likely to be more high-tech like Saudi Arabia want, because they don't have this labor, the future labor and future economy with Africa that is so important, and they lose a huge billion people market in the future. For this reason, we think it's horrible for Saudi Arabia. So I beg you to oppose.
I thank the speaker for their comments and now call on the Deputy Prime Minister. Hear, hear.
Am I still audible? Good. Cool. I'm going to do two things in this speech. Number one, I'm going to talk about the regional relations. All the rebuttal to opening opposition will be integrated within that point. Secondly, I'm going to talk about the internal legitimacy of the Saudi government and how are you increasing it. First, let's talk about regional relations. And what Jacqueline tells you is that the Ethiopian government, as a result of even threatening this and starting to do this, is going to be massively threatened as a result. Note that right now, the idea of civil war is probably doable for the Ethiopian government, insofar as no one can massively challenge them, as per CEO claiming that there is some level of army. Note that this massively shifts at the point at which Saudi Arabia comes in. There are two challenges on this. Number one is just saying that Saudi Arabia can't challenge insofar as the army is somehow massively strong. Note that number one, Saudi Arabia is just more powerful also in terms of technology, but very importantly, also comes with the threat of mobilizing the other Muslim countries that are in Saudi's sphere of influence and potentially mobilizing Saudi allies in the West, such as the US. If you do not believe that Saudi Arabia itself is quite threatening, which I think you should, you probably do believe that they are threatening if you connect them with like half of the other superpowers and like really important like other regional actors. Note that like one, this means that the threat is enough for the government to start acting. Also note that like you do not need a massive army insofar as you very often have technology, you can just like, I don't know, fucking drone them. Second challenge is that they say, but like the TPLF is not nearly as trained, so like they can't like do anything. Number one, I'm just questioning this. I do not think that this is something that they can prove. Note that if this is, as the info site states quite clearly, a group that has been struggling against the government for reasonable amount of time, I think you did have time and you probably were compelled to do and invest reasonable amount of time to your training, meaning that we think that they are probably decently trained as a result of that experience. But secondly, even if they were not, like we think that Saudi Arabia can just train them in the way that like other armies are just being trained reasonably quickly, we don't understand why that's not possible. What these two things mean is that you are either reasonably possible that you are able to replace the government itself, and I think you are able to do that quite quickly, which means that you are going to get a government that's going to be largely a proxy of Saudi Arabia, insofar as you were one of the main reasons as to why you got to win that war. But secondly, the second scenario is that you are definitely do present enough of a threat that the government will instead try to appease you to prevent you from continuing from this. What this means is that again, you will get the government to become significantly more of a Saudi proxy. There's a win-win situation, no matter which of these scenarios happen. On both sides, you're going to have an isolated government turning more closely towards Saudi Arabia because you just are enough of a threat either by yourself or with the allies. On Sudan and Egypt, they say that like if you make mess in Ethiopia, like Sudan and Egypt are going to get angry. Number one, If the current government of Ethiopia is supporting Sudan and Egypt, we think that both of the alternatives I just outlined are going to support Sudan and Egypt even more. Because know that if they are going to be more proxy to Saudi Arabia can also campaign on behalf of Egypt and ask them to support them even more. Given that we say that this outcome is going to happen relatively quickly, and the war, whatever scenario is probably would be very, very short. I think this is something that Egypt and Sudan have quite a lot of gain from, meaning that this is not something that they will get so angry about. But number two, even if it came to the sort of trade-off losing Ethiopia, I just think that Sudan and Egypt would probably much more choose Saudi Arabia over Ethiopia, insofar as Saudi Arabia is richer. It's the big Muslim superpower over a random country that doesn't even share the majority religion. We think you probably would take the Saudi side anyway, meaning that I'm unclear what is the change on their side. Lastly, just on the rest of Africa and all the description of why Africa is so incredibly important and how now all the other states are going to get angry at you, I just do not think that there is such a massive solidarity with Ethiopia, again, given how isolated the country is in terms of being a minority religion in the area. I just do not understand why the other countries do care so much about what necessarily is happening in Ethiopia. They needed to explain that. Going on secondly, in terms of the internal legitimacy of the Saudi government. Note that the context in which you should judge this argument is a couple of problems that the Saudi government is facing at the moment. Number one, you have been largely forced to liberalize, meaning that there is more outside influence coming into the country, which makes people question the royal family more. Number two, you had problems with handling badly handling recent budgetary crisis and not the best handling of COVID, plus oil prices making you being seen as less threatening. Number three, you also have other proxy wars that are significantly more complex, for example, in Yemen, which are much harder to win, which are not showing Saudi Arabia as the strongest actor. Again, the reason why this matters is because Saudi Arabia has a need to do anything that is able to increase their internal legitimacy, because right now they are in a situation where they do need something like that, and then where they would benefit massively from any sort of pump of people becoming more involved and interested in what the government is doing. We would note that the narrative of protection of Muslim minorities outside of Saudi Arabia is still something that does give you a lot of legitimacy to a large extent, for a couple of reasons. Number one, because Saudi Arabia and population of Saudi Arabia still does perceive themselves as the beacon of Muslim faith, meaning that you get a lot of pride from it and a lot of pride from showing yourself as someone who is fighting for the Muslim populations abroad. But number two, note that there were narratives that were used by the government for previous proxy wars, meaning the population is kind of adjusted to it. Before I talk later more opening opposition.
Yes, so say that you win and you now have this new government that has to control this state. How many resources and how long do you stay there in order to preserve this stability afterwards?
We think that you do not necessarily will probably not need to do that, insofar as even the fact that you are supporting the government means that you are still as a threat, meaning that no one's probably going to try to challenge the government that much, insofar as you are just the only power that's involved in it and you are reasonably strong. We think we can stay as long as we think it's needed. I don't think we need to mechanize it necessarily. I just don't think that will be a problem given how strong you are. So what this means is given how powerful that sort of narrative is, as a result of the fact that if you can monopolize this war and be able to support and show yourself to be the authority and question a government of Ethiopia that right now is not engaging with the majority Muslim North Africa, so it's perceived as something that is outside of that sphere of influence, and B, has a history of oppressing Muslim populations within its borders, the fact that you are able to question that government, threaten that government, and potentially take it out of power, and you can do it very easily, can be a massive display of power that can influence your population and turn them back into supporting of the royal family. For all those reasons, opening government.
I thank the speaker for their comments and now call on the Deputy Leader of the Opposition. Hear, hear.
Am I audible? Great. I will begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. Look, panel, I'm going to have a point on the international standing of Saudi Arabia and how this interacts with 3 main questions in this debate. The first is economic growth, the second is regional power, and the third is internal power. I'm going to explain how it interacts with each of those things. But first, a few points of rebuttal. A, we get this question of economic growth, and the main thing that we get from OO is the fact that war in the area is bad for economy. Look, they cannot both present to me Ethiopia as being poor and not a large part of the economy and everything, and also tell me that having an internal civil war in Ethiopia has a big effect on the finances of Saudi Arabia. We don't think that is true, but moreover, we think that it is just worse to put your own resources into an internal civil war in a country that I really don't know what the benefit of winning that war is actually going to be, and they put more money into those kinds of things. And also they tell me, you don't have to stay there because your strength is enough to get a government that is stable. But because that it's not how things work, you need to build infrastructure, you need to build political stability, and you're still going to have fighting factions and subgroups that are going to try and fight each other. You need to actually stay there longer in order to preserve the stability, which means you're going to continue to put these resources in elsewhere. Notice this doesn't only mean you're putting economic resources, but it means that you're losing internal power because the people inside your own country would prefer that you put those resources and money into themselves, and not all of them necessarily agree or understand that you need to get involved in Ethiopia. Look, you can have connections and present yourself as like the bringer of Islam and everywhere and the protector in places without getting involved in literally every single situation. We just don't think it is necessarily true that people in Saudi Arabia care, specifically because of this trend of liberalization, which isn't coming just from the government. It is also coming from the people themselves who are having more interactions with the Western world, and therefore it's not actually leading to opposition, and they're actually getting not as strong on those stances. But most importantly, look, OO's main benefits are they're going to get more power once they win this war. What we want to tell you is that they don't need this more power. Saudi Arabia right now is a powerhouse in the region. They are the leader of the Arab League, that is the word. They are the leader of the Arab League. They have a really strong finances. They are selling oil all over the place. They're basically a monopoly. They are already very, very strong. They do not need this win in the area in order to become even stronger. The benefit is minimal, but the risks, A, if they lose, and B, just because they are losing political standing and people won't trust them anymore, is large. So it's just not worth it for them to do that. Let's move on to talk a little bit about international standing and why we think it will be damaged. Look, we think that it is super important for Saudi Arabia to have ties with the West. Notice, even at the cost of liberalization, A, because we see that they're doing it today with their airline, with tourism, with business partners, with normalization accords, like with Israel that just happened, and the cooperation with the United States government on those things. But also, we just think the West is a great source of funding and resources, of the powerhouse of business cooperation. The stock markets are in the West, high tech is in the West. They have the brains and knowledge to bring technology into Saudi Arabia, and they have buying power. So the more people who are buying things from Saudi Arabia, and the West is, because of the amount of money involved in places, the West is the people that are going to bring more money into their economy. Because Saudi Arabia prides itself on the identity of being a financial powerhouse in the world, then that is the thing that is super important to them and will also allow them to keep internal power. Why do we think that is likely to be damaged? Look, what are the West's interests, right? A, we just think that the West endorses diplomacy over aggression, and if Saudi Arabia is viewed to be encouraging aggression, as the motion suggests, that is just something they are actively against. We see that the West is pro diplomacy in things like the Accords. And also we just think that stability and promoting stability is better for the West because then it doesn't have pressure to get involved, and also it's just better for businesses to be able to do things. So if you're promoting aggression and war, you're going to be against it. Also, they're just likely to be supporting the Ethiopian government. A, because the Ethiopian government is Christian, and because of the Islamophobia that OG themselves agree that happens. So they're already lining up with the values even better than they are lining with the other group that we're supposed to be supporting. They already have some business interactions. They have a proven body that they can talk to. They already have diplomatic ties and cooperation with the actual government and the religious alignment I already stated. This means that A, getting involved, and specifically getting involved with the subgroup, pits you against the West side and also promotes a policy of aggression that the West is against. Look, the West isn't going to sever ties entirely. What is it, because of all of this involvement, but what is it likely to do? Put more eyes on policy. When Western media, which tends to be liberal, criticizes more of your policy and forces more liberalization on you, that because it puts pressure on politicians and cooperating and countries that are cooperating with you on taking into account your policies and on businesses cooperating. For example, in Israel, we already see public backlash on the Accords because of the religious policies in Saudi Arabia and the fact that I don't know if I go as a tourist what I will be allowed to wear and not to wear. We see this backlash happening, but the more you are perceived as aggressive and the more you are perceived as promoting things that the West is against, the more likely it is that eyes are upon you. This means that in order to have the political power to continue ties with you, the politicians and businesses are going to have to openly speak because they are going to be asked about their opinion on your religious policies, and you're going to be they have to show that they are willing to do something or justify their decisions. This means that there are two impacts. A, less countries and businesses, it will be worth it for them to have those ties with you because of the cost is too high. And B, there's just going to be more intervention, more attention, and more call to power. Before I continue, I will take you opening.
So the West doesn't care about Saudi aggression anywhere. They actively support it, for example, in Yemen, because they like Saudi oil and they also like a powerful Middle East ally.
Again, I didn't say I don't think the West is going to sever ties. I think it's going to care enough. The more eyes are on it, the more likely it is that the public cares enough in order to put pressure on politicians to get involved and to put pressure on businesses to not have ties with Saudi Arabia. We think that the more involvement there is, we think that the more, in terms of internal power, the more likely it is that the liberalization process isn't going to perceive as something natural that's happening, but something that is being forced upon from outside sources. So there's less likely to be it's less likely to be accepted, and it's less likely to be accepted, and it's more likely to be like it's more likely to not be from a sense of power, but to lead to instability when people don't accept it. When it comes to economic growth, we think losing those ties and having people not trust you, not want to have business with you is also going to be an issue, which leads to less economic growth. And when it comes to regional power, look, we think that regional power, if you want to be taken seriously as a superpower and given the opportunities to do things and have power and participate in accords and be cooperated with, then you need to be taken seriously. But also we give you the context of a conflict that if you take a side in, you are risking losing your position. It would be better if you don't take a side in this conflict at all. And it would be better if you were there to mediate as opposed to this conflict, each side trying to take advantage, to take responsibility for it on their own and continuing this instability. Because we showed you more economic growth, regional power, and internal power on our side, please oppose.
I thank the speaker for their comments and now call on the member of government. Here.
Can everyone hear me? Never in the history of international relations has a great power ever cared about being nice. The reason why countries like Saudi Arabia and the United States engage in proxy wars isn't because they necessarily care about who's going to win or about the principle. It's because they're incredibly profitable and it's a great way to make money. Opening half largely talked about the outcomes of this war and whether this is good or bad. Frankly, we don't care. Closing government is extremely simple. We're going to say, regardless of who wins this conflict, the prospects of conflict itself is something that's good for us. One, because it's a great way for us to make money. And second, why it creates insecurity in the region and allows us to strengthen our hold on Muslim countries in Africa, particularly the ones that border Ethiopia, like Eritrea and Sudan. I think opening opposition, like dealing with them very quickly, misses the context for, and I think a lot of the arguments fall out of the round, because while they say that this may be like a bad, like this isn't a good thing for like Saudi like power or whatever, I think that deals with a lot of the OG case of why winning this is not necessarily good. So I think that becomes a wash, but they don't explain why their world is one where not engaging in conflict is better for strengthening Saudi alliances and strengthening Saudi ties in Africa. Because the context that they forgot to tell you was, one, the Arab League is right now incredibly weak. Second, Egypt is moving away from Saudi Arabia. And third, there is very little ability for Saudi Arabia to compete with countries like China and Iran, and engaging in that fight is incredibly expensive. So given this, how do we then get our ties back and how do we strengthen our hold in this region? The second thing to note is I think there's a lot of fiat assumed on behalf of opening government. I think they give you a lot of reasons why winning this conflict is good, but don't do enough to explain why logically Saudi is going to win in order to necessarily claim a lot of their impacts. our arguments are only going to assume that the conflict happens, which I think is fair, and nothing else necessarily occurs from that. We don't care who wins. We don't care how long it goes on for. We don't care what happens. Independent of the results of this or how this conflict happens, why is this in itself a good thing? So first, why is this a profitable thing to do? I think little to do with like how this conflict actually happens. Conflicts are good for great powers because they're a great way to make money. Two key reasons. One is because civil wars often need a lot of oil. Saudi Arabia being one of the largest exporters in the world, this is a great way for them to sell oil and for them to make a lot of money. The second thing is that if like you can like, even though you're like giving aid, you can sell this oil to these people, and instability also means that oil production in that area goes down. So when oil production goes down, and Saudi is one of the few suppliers, this is a way for the price of oil to go up. So the price of oil can go up as well when they sell it to other people. The second thing is your ability to sell ammunition. So just because you're giving them aid doesn't mean they also don't buy stuff from you. So a lot of this time, aid comes in the form of discounts or like giving them some ammunition, but you also get a lot of like sales from this group. So you get a lot of spending on military equipment, you get spending on ammunition, and a lot of these things, like what Saudi does with Yemen, for instance. I think this means it's a good way for them to make money in this way as well. Why is this important? One, I think currently the commodities market is pretty bad because of COVID. Very few people are driving cars and the price of oil is down generally. This is a good way for you to raise these prices artificially in a time when prices are bad. Second, it's one of the few ways to boost your economy in a time when other businesses like IT or tech are falling. It's a good way for Saudi, like private public partnerships like with the military to like raise their stock prices and make more money. The fourth thing is, if this conflict gets messy and other actors enter as well, we're fine with that because it likely means that some of them are going to buy things like oil and ammunition from Saudi-linked companies, and it's another mechanism for us to make money. So regardless of how this happens, the conflict happening itself is a good way for us to make money. The second thing is then why is it that conflict is a good mechanism for gaining favor with other countries? I think the crux of this argument is we don't care whether these countries like us or not. It is just that they need to be dependent on us. I think the reason why the Arab League has failed is because most of these countries are becoming independent of Saudi Arabia and are gaining more power. We need to take that back and we need to like reclaim our power over them. I think two things. One is like the borders where this conflict could like spew into are the ones that matter. So Sudan and Eritrea, which are Muslim majority countries, we have a fleeting alliance with and we're losing power over because they have there's competition with China in the region and Iran who also wants influence over them. I think just using the carrot is a pretty foolish way to try and get this when you have to compete with these countries, when you could use the stick instead to gain favor. Opening government says the mechanism to get this is good optics. Great. Our mechanism is how, if we give them protection, this is a good way for us to get favor. Before I do that, I'll happily take closing opposition. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So
Okay,
I guess I'm going to get specific. How do you say that they make any kind of profit when your own opening has characterized the Tigray people and Ethiopia as a whole as extremely poor, and also that Saudi Arabia buys all the weapons they give away at cost from other nations?
One, it's not just this group, it's a proxy conflict. Two is, if they can fund a civil war, they probably have backers from other parts of the world that also have like a stake in this. Like, you can't have a civil war and not have any money, otherwise you just lose and it's over. I think this motion assumes that a civil war happens. So here's the context for us gaining influence that's more important than opening government. One is we can offer them protection in the form of making sure that the civil war is contained. So we make sure it doesn't go across and goes into their borders. Second, I think the reason why this matters is because they can't just go to other powers for this. Other countries don't have an interest in this civil war and are probably not going to bother. Third, this also means it's harder for them to oppose Saudi Arabia. So if they try and oppose us, then we can just not give them protection, and then the civil war can bleed into their borders and they can suffer. The reason why this matters is because, one, this is likely to lead to a lot of refugees and affecting commerce on the borders, greatly harming the economy and also economic confidence in these countries in a time of great economic insecurity. The second thing is that it's important because we want Eritrea to spend less money on maritime trade and maritime investments in the Red Sea so that we can have more control over that, for one, like more Saudi trade, and second, to have more control over the Yemen war and that specific isle, and have that investment go instead to border security. Third is, I think we can extend or keep the conflict at whatever level we want in order for this to be strategic for us. So if these allies are getting shaky, or if these countries don't want to cooperate with us, we can just make the conflict worse so that we get more of their cooperation. We don't care what happens. We just want war to happen because it's good for us. It's profitable. It helps us gain favor. Very proud to propose.
I thank the speaker for their comments and now call on the member of opposition. Hear, hear.
Okay, can everybody hear me? Hello? Perfect. Okay. So I prefer to take POIs in the chat, and feel free to raise your hand as well to try to get my attention. Please be conservative with that, maybe not distracting. But for sure, if it looks like I'm missing it, feel free to raise your hand. Now, but I'll do my best to take a POI. I will, my timer. I will begin in 3, 2, 1. All right, so I think first thing we need to do is, now that we're kind of in the back half of the debate, let's reiterate what Saudi Arabia cares about. They care about enhancing the image of Sunni Muslims, or Muslim, as well as Muslim Islam as a whole, and spreading that from a kind of a religious faith perspective. They care about the international stage standing, particularly with the US. And that was kind of addressed by our opening. They care about winning, quite frankly, because our points will show why even having a dragged out conflict, and that'll directly clash with our back half, having a dragged out conflict or even losing will dramatically hurt them. And even if they win, this sucks for them. And finally, they want to, at least in some way, shape, or form, disadvantage Ethiopia. And I think our points will really prove why this doesn't disadvantage the ruling government and actually lends them more legitimacy. So firstly, let's get into some rebuttal, right? So we get this assertion from opening half that money equals competency on the side of the Saudi Arabian government. First of all, the Saudi Arabian government has never won any proxy war they've engaged in. In fact, they are known to just engage in them and then disengage after a while. They're not actually very competent, and they just kind of throw money at the problem and try to facilitate instability. And our points will show why this instability won't be facilitated within the 90% of Ethiopia. Another thing is that they say we can have this kind of cascade effect with other minorities who are against the federal government. Yes, that's the status quo. And that's why it's precisely in Saudi Arabia's interest to facilitate the status quo, because Ethiopia is breaking down from all the minority tensions. This actually provides a rallying point for Ethiopia to rally, to change this from a failure for them to satisfy the different ethnic tensions to them say, hey, we're a Christian nation and we're against the leader of the Arab League, right? And so that'll bring us into our second point, and we'll address this more later. I think it's unfortunate that throughout this debate, there's been a characterization from the government side of Arab nations or Islamic nations as a monolith. They are not. They have many distinctions, and we think that their neighbors will take won't just kind of fall over and thank Saudi Arabia for stirring shit in their backyard, because they might see it as, you know, Sunni expansionism. They might see it as the ethnic white Arabs kind of messing with the power plays of African ethnicities, right? This is a big thing that causes a lot of tension between the factions within Africa versus Saudi Arabia, and we think this will be received poorly. In either way, this is kind of asserted by their side, and we think we shouldn't really buy that. Finally, profit, ridiculous. There's no profit to be made. Saudi Arabia has no manufacturing industry. They buy all of these at cost. This war will be costly for them in the short term and especially in the long run. Yeah, that's ridiculous. And finally, and that's ridiculous. So let's get into our kind of positive matter, right? So why will it ultimately fail? 3 points. Firstly, the Saudi Arabian military, when they engage in proxy wars, they don't train an army to do that. They don't do that. At the most, they do airstrikes, and then they throw money and try to arm the local population, right? This has been shown to be ineffective when it comes to try to have a small population win against a big majority, right? The Tigray region is not going to become independent. Oh, by the way, another piece of extraneous rebuttal. Sorry, I'm kind of all over the place. But when they talk about maritime control of the Red Sea, the Tigray region is landlocked. This will not happen. They do not border the Red Sea. All of the ports are outside the Tigray region. If not, then instability may bleed over. But sure, I'll take a point of clarification from CG.
Yeah, no, Eritrea borders the Red Sea and we get control over them on our side.
Okay,
so
thank you.
In this debate, like if these people can afford to go to conflict, how is it the case that they have no money? It's absurd that they can't make profit.
Yeah, we think you're defending a dead point. It'd be in your interest to drop it. So why will they ultimately fail, right? So proxy war, they're not good at winning those, so they're probably not going to win. Also, we think that there's no infrastructure currently in the poor and destitute Tigray region for them to sustain a winnable war. So we think that at most they're in a bad spot to begin with. Another thing is that the Ethiopian government is the Ethiopian government's army is very good at defensive war because they're very disciplined and they are known to have a strong state of war readiness in the way that they have beat off Boko Haram in the area quite successfully. So that's why they'll fail. That's the most likely scenario. But even if they have a long drawn out conflict, we think this is bad for Saudi Arabia's aims. Why? Because this will lead to a stronger Ethiopian federal state. Because this will unite all the ethnic minorities under the one thing they have in common. They are 90% Christian. And so because of this, the authoritarian government will gain legitimacy in that saying that we are the sole defender that you should rally around to defend your faith. And this has been proven to be a potent thing for governments for Ethiopian governments to do in the past to rally their people against an invading force. In fact, this will be made even worse by the characterization that we get all across government bench as Saudi Arabia as the leader of the Arab League. So this will be seen even more explicitly as an invasion of their religious rights or of their religious homeland. And so we think this will lead to large rallying force and shift this to a religious war, which will benefit the Ethiopian federal state and will benefit the presidency as a whole from the very thing that is threatening him the most at this moment. So this does not help the Saudi Arabian aim of destabilizing Ethiopia or toppling the current leaders. Finally, we think that there's kind of a big harm that has gone ignored, which is the suffering of the Tigray people. We think there's kind of an ethical dimension to this. We think that you're essentially saying, hey, we want to engage in a proxy war, and these are Sunni people. These are people that Saudi Arabia at least has some form of religious linkage with, right? They care about them as a bastion of Sunni in the area. And so we think that if you engage them in a war that they are likely to lose or at the most get beat down slowly, we think that this leads to a premature loss of Sunni influence in an area where they sorely want it. And so this is something that they do not want, and they might care about fellow Sunnis, who knows? And finally, yeah, it's just shitty on the international stage. Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, has a strong interest in Western industry, and this is kind of the link that was missing out of our front half. This is why they want it, and this is why they want international investment. Is because Saudi Arabia wants to diversify away from oil, right? They're too tied in, and that's why they're trying to sell shares of Aramco, and that's why they're trying to diversify in various things. All of this needs Western support. All of this needs Western influence, and so they lose out on that, particularly because Western influence has a strong attachment to Christian countries. And so, all of this. So in this, Mohammed bin Salman, who controls the international affairs of Saudi Arabia, as well as their domestic affairs, he's basically in control. It's an authoritarian state. He cares personally about this. So this is not in his interest. And as not the figurehead, but the head of the Saudi Arabian state, this is important to consider. Yeah, so I think we kind of beat them in every scenario, and for that, we proudly oppose.
Thank the speaker for their comments, and now call on the government whip. Hear, hear.
All right. Are you able to hear me? Okay. Before I get into responding to the op bench, I want to make one thing clear, which is our comparison against our opening government team. We don't rely on winning the conflict to have a perceptual deterrence effect or threat against other nations in order to receive like this kind of clout of looking good in other people's eyes. We don't care how we look in other people's eyes in Saudi Arabia. We just care if they rely on us for our security relationships and dependence. This is a unique extension, one of the unique extensions coming out of closing government.
that isn't even reliant on our other extension that has to do with like profiting off of the conflict. This just has to do with stoking military anxiety of actors that border Tigray, for example, like Eritrea and Sudan, that are key security partners with Saudi Arabia right now, that we want to strengthen those relationships by having them rely on Saudi Arabia more, because A, the cost of challenging Saudi Arabia in a time of insecurity is much higher, and B, because now that they have a threat along their borders, they want to deepen their existing allies in order to fight off existing foes. That is the dynamic that we want to set up to strengthen those relationships. We don't care about like perceptual deterrence. Secondly, the thing on OG is that they're very unclear about which proxy conflicts are important to Saudi Arabia, like what's the most important one, and how exactly is that benefiting Saudi Arabia. Let me be very clear. Saudi Arabia is supporting the Hadi government in Yemen to fight off against like the Houthi rebels that are being backed by Iran. This is an important conflict to them because it represents a battle between Saudi Arabia and Iran for influence in the region on the Arabian Peninsula. This is incredibly key, not only because it lies on the border of Saudi Arabia, involving like refugees and literal armed conflict along their border that disrupts commerce, but because of the fact that it has to do with winning over an ally on the Arabian Peninsula and what's going to happen with that government and who it's going to side with. Let me be clear about how Eritrea and Sudan fit into this conflict, right? Right now, Eritrea and Sudan have existing military or security relationships with Saudi Arabia. The problem is that we want to strengthen those relationships, so Eritrea does things like let Saudi Arabia use their military bases that are along the coastline that help us be able to capitalize on like dominance over the Red Sea, because those are important locations that are very close to Yemen and help us be able to clamp down on Houthi rebels, the supplies that Iran deliver to them, and be able to support the Hadi government in that conflict. This is like the principal conflict that is really important, and notify how it is key because it defines relationships, for example, like Saudi Arabia with the West, right? And in terms of those areas of support. This is the key context for which we say that like our extension on how like stoking military anxiety among Eritrea and Sudan in order to strengthen these relationships has gone completely uncontested and ignored by closing opposition. And I think our level of specificity causes us to rise above OG. Let me now compare to closing opposition before I get into opening opposition. First, like their response, like it's clear that they're below us in this debate because their response to our contention is very flippant, right? They say, oh, there's no profit to be made, moving on, let me argue about other things in this debate. Aside from munitions, the effect on oil prices is incredibly profitable, even if we're net spending on the conflict itself, right? So the other ways in which we profit is incredibly key. Even if like you have long-term projects to diversify, which isn't realistically happening in a time frame. I'm pretty sure CO knows that. Secondly, like we can sell to literally any side or any supporter of the conflict. Military anxiety of all actors causes these people, Eritrea, Sudan, even Ethiopia, to dig into existing supply chains of which like Saudi Arabia is a part of. That means like energy, but also munitions, and in any ways that Saudi Arabia can profit. This is why like great powers have been doing this since like the dawn of time of like stoking these conflicts so they can profit from both ends. Finally, there's this point on CO that says like Tigray and the TPLF like can't win. Look, we don't care about winning. We're not dependent on that. That's what makes us distinct from OG. Instead, we say insurgencies have many different advantages. They can use guerrilla warfare. They have asymmetric tactics, and they disguise combatants in order to prolong the conflict. We're perfectly fine with these tactics because it means that our like the time of which we can profit from this conflict is extended. But let's be very clear about something. This does not cause a unification of a new like crusade within Ethiopia against the TPLF. First of all, the TPLF is a Christian group. We already know that. But secondly, the cause of the TPLF has pre-existed Saudi Arabian influence. Like the fact of the matter is that Tigray is not like this like one Muslim area in a whole Christian nation. That's not how this works. Like this cause is pre-existed. Many of these people are Christian, and there's even if there's a unification effect to some end, we still think conflict is going to like prevail for a while in this area and can still be profitable, right? It's funny how like they point out that we're generalizing about the Muslim world. Meanwhile, they generalize about all the Christian groups within Ethiopia and saying like, oh, they'll be able to like squash their differences just because they want to like fight another one of the Christian groups that exists within Ethiopia. This is a very odd extension, and I don't think weighs nearly heavily against us being able to directly profit from the conflict on multiple ends, but also extend our ability to have security. Before I move on to OO, I think I'll take a POI from them.
Notice panel that whether they win or lose, long or short, we showed you that Saudi Arabia has more to lose than it has to gain from any involvement in the conflict. Because it is already rich and powerful and doesn't need this source of money or power, which risks local and international trust. GovSide needs to explain why this involvement is necessary to justify the risks.
Is that your case? Like, we don't need things, like we don't need to get extra stuff, like obviously we always want to like benefit Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has interests to get more business, to get more money, to like get more power. Like obviously these are the interests. If you had a problem with that, you should have maybe contested OG on what Saudi Arabia's interests are. Maybe they're just fine. They want to stay where they are. They don't want to grow. Like if that was your case, I think you're losing the debate. But let's respond to really what your case is, which is that supporting, because they do care about their power, right? Because your case is that supporting rebels in Tigray, Ethiopia, means that they're going to flip Saudi Arabia's current security relationships with Sudan, Egypt, and the West. This is a ridiculous extension because they need to, like, you needed to prove how you actually reached the threshold of flipping existing dynamics. We say instead, military insecurity is a reason why these nations double down on their relying for Saudi Arabia for security, because they seek out support for these domestic concerns with Tigray. And secondly, challenging Saudi Arabia becomes more expensive in these times of conflict on their borders. But on this topic of the West, if Saudi Arabia funding terrorist groups directly in the Middle East isn't enough to stop the US from like partnering with them and allying them in the war against Yemen, I don't know what will. Unclear to me why like this insurgency in Ethiopia is like the bright line for changing the dynamic between the US and Saudi Arabia and the support that they get from the West. Clearly, the like Yemeni war is like the prime relationship here defining like Saudi Arabia and the West. The key thing is like OO did not prove how they reached that threshold, so it's very unlikely that they actualize their benefits. Even if this action makes the relationship somewhat tense, they need to use like a big stick policy to rein in these relationships. Logistical reliance here is dominant, and that's the key mechanism, not a perceptual one, by which we grow Saudi Arabia's power. Very proud to propose.
I thank the speaker for their comments and now call on the opposition whip. Here.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Yeah, all right, awesome. So let me grab my timer and then I can get started. Okay. Okay, and much like everyone else within the round for POIs, please feel free to message in the chat. And if it looks like I'm not responding in the chat, to just, hand wave or anything like that. That should be completely fine. Okay. I'm going to get started in 3, 2, 1. I think this debate is going to be won off of the team that can best prove to you what exactly the goals of Saudi Arabia were meant to be within the status quo, and which of the teams shows to you that Saudi Arabia gets the majority of its goals satisfied on their side. I think CO and opposition as a whole has done this. That's why opposition is going to win today's debate. No external rebuttal. Thankfully, I think everything actually flows very nicely within this round. So we have 3 crystallization questions to prove why CO has won today's debate. 1, what are the goals of Saudi Arabia within the status quo? 2, does Saudi Arabia gain any sort of benefit when looking at its goals within Ethiopia? And then 3, does Saudi Arabia gain any sort of benefit when looking at its goals outside of Ethiopia? Let's start with number 1. What exactly are the goals of Saudi Arabia within the status quo? I think that understanding this comes first and foremost to anything else within the round, because it doesn't matter if the government or opposition proves who will win this conflict or what will happen after this conflict if we aren't on the same page about what exactly Saudi Arabia wants within the status quo. Thankfully, the round hasn't disagreed on this too heavily, so we have some pretty clear things to work off of and don't need to spend too much time on it, but there's a little bit of contention when we get to the back half CG. We'll cover that in a second. Here, I think OG and OO gives us some slightly different terminology and slightly different ideas trying to refer to the same points. So I want to give us 4 big goals that I think you get out of my partner's speech, which I think encompasses everything we've heard within the round and I think is the fairest way to measure this round. 1, to promote Sunni influence within the region, not just Arab influence, not just Muslim influence, but Sunni influence specifically. 2, to destabilize Ethiopia because Saudi Arabia does not like the Ethiopian government. 3, to win the conflict, and I'll explain to you why this is such an important point, because I think this is probably the most contentious one we've got. And 4th, to create a strong position for itself on the international stage. Why do I find it important to bring up these things up again? Well, for 2 reasons. 1, again, I think the team that's going to win is the one that can show that all of their points and arguments flow through these 4 main goals. But 2, I think this will allow us to examine why I think CG ultimately falls out of the round. See, the issue with CG is that they focus in really heavily on this idea of profit and the idea of whether or not the conflict fails. Whether or not the conflict fails, we want to do this because it will lead to economic benefit for Saudi Arabia. That's their biggest contribution to the round. They say oil will help. They say keeping the region reliant on Saudi Arabia will help. They say that they want to continue the conflict and make it as bad as they need, etc., etc. There are 2 issues with this. 1, they don't explain to you why you get economic benefits in the short term. Now, they're saying my partner is really flippant about it, but I think that they never actually respond to his POI or his analysis, so I think he has some right to be flippant about it, right? He correctly points out that very, very clearly, Saudi Arabia does not develop these resources or these weapons on its own. Saudi Arabia is mostly focused on oil. He also explains the idea that Saudi Arabia will have to buy these resources from other regions in order to actually help the region within Ethiopia, meaning that's an economic cost in the short and the long term. He explains to the idea economically of also the fact that Ethiopia is not exactly a very rich country, showing contradictions within government's case and the idea that economically this doesn't seem very viable, right? I think they don't explain to you why this very resource poor country will be able to provide them with much, and why Saudi Arabia, which doesn't have this resources on its own, will suddenly be able to maintain itself within this conflict. But even if they do, even if they convince you of all of this analysis and convince you that there's some kind of economic benefit, that matters less because that's a short-term economic benefit, right? This matters less than the long-term harms that my partner uniquely explains to you, right? Where he explains in every other goal about Saudi Arabia, the idea of promoting Sunni influence, the idea of destabilizing Ethiopia, winning the conflict, creating a strong position on the international stage. Those are all long-term important goals for Saudi Arabia as a nation, and closing government ignores all of them for a singular goal on economic conflict. That's why they fall out of the round. With that out of the way, let's go to my second crystallization question. Does Saudi Arabia gain any sort of benefit when looking at its goals within Ethiopia? Here, let's analyze 3 of the big goals for Saudi Arabia: to promote Sunni influence, to destabilize Ethiopia, and to win the conflict. This is particularly a problem that we see in OG, where we're going to prove why they fall out of the round, or not fall out of the round, they're in the round, but why we beat them within this round. Even if you buy the historically and factually inaccurate depiction of Saudi Arabian power over its borders and the idea that a 6% population will be able to stand up against an army which has historically managed to exist within a Muslim-dominated area, they don't really give us many impacts for why this is beneficial for Saudi Arabia. I'd say they give you 2. 1, the idea this will allow the Saudi Arabian government to use Ethiopia as a proxy government, and 2, that Saudi Arabia gains some form of legitimacy within this region of the world when they can live up to their status of this beacon of Muslim hope within the region. Okay, on the first point, I think that this is absolutely absurd mischaracterization of what the end result of this will look like. To the point that you buy my partner's analysis about the power of the Ethiopian Federal Army, the weakness of the Tigrayan population, and the inability for Saudi Arabia to fight proxy conflicts, all unique analysis of the status quo you get exclusively from CO, they can't claim any sort of Saudi Arabian influence when there is very little impact to be had from that. But 2, even if you don't buy our analysis and instead buy the idea that some sort of equal conflict will occur and some kind of influence will happen, OG never explains why this Ethiopian government, which is somehow still powerful enough to not be completely toppled, will be all right with acting as a proxy. It doesn't make logical sense. If anything, it's much more likely that they will instead use this situation to promote the perception my partner gives you about the idea that this harms the destabilizing of Ethiopia, when Ethiopian governments can now claim the idea of falling under the Christian banner to defeat the Muslim threat coming from externally from outside of the region. I think this point goes largely unrebutted within the round. I think we only get 2 pieces of rebuttal from CG. CG tells you, 1, that Tigray is majority Christian, which is factually untrue, and you don't even need to have knowledge of the reason to know it's untrue. The motion is clearly placing Saudi Arabia, a Sunni majority country, in comparison to this region within Ethiopia for a reason. But 2, that they won't squash their differences in order to work together against the Muslim threat. I think this is again, mischaracterization of how ideologically powerful the Christian versus Judaism versus Muslim conflict has been within the Middle East, right? I think that people are very much willing to squash their differences, at least to a degree, when they see this Muslim conflict coming so heavily and they see such a big harm. We've seen this historically, authoritarian governments rallying against an external threat to gain legitimacy. Okay. With that out of the way, very quickly, 3, does this benefit Saudi Arabia with its goals outside of Ethiopia? I think this ties into the idea of it being beneficial on the international stage. Within the region, I don't think you get this, because their claim of this idea that you're going to, be a Muslim beacon of hope doesn't actually work when my partner explains to you that not all Muslims are the same, not all Arab countries are the same, not everyone's going to see Saudi Arabia in this positive light. But internationally, this also doesn't work from my partner's unique analysis on the idea that the leader of this country will want to have Western influence and Western support to diversify away from oil. He won't risk this. As a result, proud to oppose. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for their comments, and thank you everyone for what was a really enjoyable debate. Congratulations to you all. So I think that will probably conclude us now. I presume that's fine. I know we're still streaming, so but yeah, I'd just like to invite you to step out, and hopefully you'll hear from us soon. Thanks very much, guys, and well done again. Good job.
Thank you, guys.
Is it possible to turn off the stream? No?
I'm almost certain we can turn off the stream.
Yeah, I just don't know that I can do it. This is a question for the volunteer who is here, really.
We could always deliberate on Discord, worst case.
That's true too. Okay, I might just, do you think they're here? I presume not. I might just put.
We can ask it just in the Discord, right?
In Discord, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm just gonna do that. What room are we in? Sorry, Hertford?
Yeah, Hertford.
Okay, I just actually need to run out, so I'm just gonna, we'll just take a couple minutes maybe to look over, and then if this isn't resolved and we don't get an answer, we can go to Discord. So I'll talk to you in a few minutes.
Yeah, cool.
Okay, it looks like we have to leave the call, so we might just rejoin in Discord in arbitrary room 1. I believe we've been directed to, if that's okay.
Cool. Yeah,
Talk to you
arbitrary
guys
room
there.
1.
Mm-hmm.